Bartlesville Wesleyan College, in conjunction with First Wesleyan Church of Bartlesville, Oklahoma, are pleased to present Dr. Marion P. Birch in a series of lectures entitled The Challenge of Islam. Dr. Birch, the son of pioneer missionaries, was born and raised in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and he and his wife, Marjorie, have spent over 30 years of ministry to the Muslims of West Africa. Dr. Birch shares with us from his rich experience and from his considerable research in the area of the religion of Islam, and we welcome Dr. Birch this evening for this first in a series of lectures on the challenge of Islam. Dr. Birch.
Thank you, Professor. I praise the Lord for the privilege of being back. I've already met some wonderful friends that we have become acquainted with when we were here on 2 other occasions, and praise the Lord for it. Sorry Marjorie isn't with me, but she's praying, and I'm relying on that, and thank the Lord for it. It's a privilege to speak on this topic. I'm so happy that Brother Marion Brugdenhill is heading up the Department of World Missions, the Department of Missions in connection with Bartlesville Wesleyan College, because as he and I have been conversing, we realize now how green we were when we went to the mission field. Rather ill-prepared, in spite of the fact you had an AB degree. And I just praise the Lord for the fact that he is endeavoring to make for the Wesleyans, I hope, a real training center for those who will be prepared to go into cross-cultural missionary service. I think that's commendable, and praise the Lord for it. At Brother Marion Brugdenhill's suggestion, he wanted me to touch things that have been happening in recent history relative to the development of Islam, the rising tide of Islam, its tremendous resurgence. And so consequently, my lecture tonight may be a wee bit more on the secular side and the historical side than anything that would supply a spiritually positive presentation. But if you can come another time, tomorrow night we will be studying what is Islam and dealing with Muhammad and the Quran and the practices of Muslims, the beliefs of Muslims, and so forth, so that we really get in depth somewhat as to what we face as we become equipped to bridge the gap between our position in understanding truth and their position, and by the grace of the Lord and the illumination of the Holy Spirit and the work of the Word, bring them on through to saving faith in Christ Jesus. A tremendous task. So, the last 2 lectures will deal with bridges to the Muslim mind and mother experience teaching us some tips and tactics about reaching Muslims. So I think things will be a wee bit more positive on the last 2 lectures than perhaps in tonight's presentation. The challenge of Islam is facing Christians all over the world. It has grown as a surging green tide, and as you know, you can't do a great deal about standing and withstanding the rising tide. In our case, if we're talking about down at the seashore at Corpus Christi, there's nothing you can do about it. You just wait till the tide comes in and the tide goes out. This rising tide, the green tide of Islam, is not only coming in quietly, it is coming in with a roar. Perhaps some of you remember back to September 1981 when President Sadat of Egypt stated that he stated in real exasperation, "I am dealing with fanatics." And within a month, his body had 5 bullets or pieces of shrapnel ebbing away his life, proving the point of his suggestion that he was working with fanatics. And from the second floor of the hospital, an announcer made a quotation from the Quran saying, "Only God lives forever." And that meant he had lost the battle for life. Then again in April 83, the bombing of the American embassy and that deafening roar went throughout all of Beirut, of course, and even around the world. A daring suicide driver had wreaked havoc on a 7-story complex. There was Robert Ames, the CIA chief, and 8 of his operatives crushed to death. And some 63 corpses were mined from that wreckage. And among them, of course, the Lebanese guards who had been on duty at the time. There were 100 others who suffered injury during that one blast. 6 months later, that is in October of 83, just after dawn one morning, the equivalent of 6 tons of dynamite blew up the 4-story building that housed over 300 of our USA Marines and other Navy personnel as well. 241 perished. In December 1983, 6 bombs rocked Kuwait, a tiny Persian Gulf state. The targets were the U.S. and the French embassy and the residential compound, an airport tower and an oil facility and the like of this. Those 17 who were apprehended and caught and tried and imprisoned are the basis for yesterday's hijacking, which is still being carried on today. They want those 17 prisoners in Kuwait released. And that's why they're still on the scramble for it. And then in September of 84, 13 died in East Beirut at the annex of the U.S. Embassy, victims of a 2,000-pound load of explosives that were carried in a cream-colored Chevy van because there were militants ready and willing to pay the price of self-destruction in order to fight back. And so the reverberations of these explosions have gone not only in the immediate scene, but around the world as well, letting us know that Islam is awake and on the move. And that's what we are finding. The Amal Party, Mr. Nabi Bari, the president of the Amal Party, puts it this way. We look to the Iranian Revolution, in my opinion, as the third great revolution of history. First there was the French, then the Russian, and now the Islamic Revolution, which is changing many things in the world. It has renewed the way of Muhammad. And then Jafar Naimri, the former president of the Sudan, says, Islam has come. We shall follow the rules of the Prophet Muhammad or we will die for it. There is no alternative to God's Sharia. That is, of course, the code of laws that govern all of Muslims' behavior. What is Islam? Just to give a quick synopsis in the terms of one or two of their own authors, may I say, Islam, quoting, Islam is what Muslims do in obedience to the Quran and the example of Muhammad, peace be upon him. And any person who comes forward with belief and conforms his life to the commandments of God is on the right path. Another quotation. Practical in its tenets and realistic in its outlook, it is the one true religion for all of humanity. Another quotation. Islam alone is the answer to the cry and the search of the soul seeking the path of rationality and truth. And so Muslims really believe that they've got the one true religion, the only religion that is worth following. And this is one of the motivations that drive them on. Islam implies surrender or submission to God. That's the root meaning of the word Islam. Allah alone is God and Muhammad is his prophet is the confession that brings you into the Muslim faith. You become a Muslim once you make that confession in sincerity from your heart. Therefore, Islam is the faith and the practice of the Muslim people. Since millions and more millions of Muslims believe that Islam is the natural religion and the right one and the only true path, wisdom requires that we begin to understand what they consider the one and only, the true religion, and particularly in its present resurgence. This new crusade not only challenges the West from the standpoint of politics, not only does it challenge the West from the standpoint of the economy and economics worldwide, it challenges Christians to face the rising tide of Islam. Because these people believe that they have the unique, universal religion which ought to be spread around the entire world. And they're on the drive to do it. Let's understand a wee bit more about the divisions between the two main branches of the Islamic faith. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, he had failed to designate any Khalifa, any successor. Now, of course, we know that Muhammad was supposed to be the final seal of the prophets, the last prophet from God Almighty, and from that point of view, he could not be replaced. But he had established the religio-political Islam, and consequently there had to be a leader for this community, and therefore they endeavored to secure one who would be the successor, one that would enforce the laws, one that would fight for the faith, and one who would give guidance, particularly in times of peace. The companions of the prophet is a phrase designating those who are the very early believers, and they actually fled with Muhammad from Medina all the way to Yathrib, which eventually became Medina, some 250 miles to the north of Mecca. And consequently, these companions of the prophet believed that any one of the early believers had a right to become the Caliphate. And so they settled by consensus on Abu Bakr, who happened to be a son-in-law of the prophet. But others, such as those from the aristocracy of Mecca, desired to capture the caliphate for the family of Umayyah. And then there was the third group, those called the legitimatists. They are those who were linked with Ali. Ali had married the only daughter of Muhammad, and consequently was not only a cousin of Muhammad, but was also a son-in-law of Muhammad, and he thought by hereditary rights he should have been in the line to carry the caliphate, to become the successor of Muhammad. Abu Bakr died within 2 years, and then Umar became the caliph, and he expanded the Islamic community quite considerably, what with his powers of warfare. And he was also the one who prepared for the collecting of the holy revelations, presumably, having come from God through Gabriel to Muhammad, which were memorized. And so, with a chain of authority called the Isnad, then came the tradition proper. And so these were called the Hadith, the traditions. That was the second source for the establishment of Muslim theology and jurisprudence, the laws that govern the affairs of state, of politics, of personal life, and everything is called the Sharia. And then 2 more were devised later on because they always bumped into new situations and they didn't have a quotation from the Hadith and they didn't have a quotation from the Quran, so they had to come to a consensus of opinion by the ruling community, and that became then the third source. And then when they ran out of ability to apply the rules, they went on to agree to the QYAS, QYAS, which refers to analytical thinking, And so if this was done in this case, this runs parallel to that case, and consequently, these four main blocks became the foundation blocks for the establishment of the Sharia, the jurisprudence of Islam. And then there were four schools of Muslims that developed. Now, there were conflicts between them and so forth, but eventually these four schools accepted these four foundations for believing what they should do as they follow the practice and the will of God as revealed in Islam, and consequently they became the followers of the Sunnah, the practice or the way of Muhammad. And so they are called the Sunni Islams. Approximately 87 to 90% of the Muslims of the world are Orthodox Muslims in the sense that they are referred to as Sunni Muslims. We will get on then to what the Shiites are in just a moment. The assassination of Uthman, the third caliph, opened the door for Ali. And you know Ali had been coveting this position for quite some time. But his troubled because the governor of Damascus, who was related to the Uthman who had been murdered, calculated that Ali hadn't punished the murderer. So Ali was murdered. And then, as a result, Hassana, his oldest son, fought for the caliphate again, and he perished. And then Hussein, the youngest son, came through, and he rallied a band of only about 100 people, and they were nothing in comparison to the thousands of troops under the Umayyad caliph. And he was warned time and again, you'll never be able to swing it, you'll die in the process, and he thought it was better to die for what he believed and to die for the right of his family to accede to the caliphate and rule and lead Islam than to live. And so he went into battle, and this was about 48 years after the death of Muhammad, and in 680 AD he perished. He fought on and on, even when others deserted him. He fought on and on until he was downed, until he was decapitated near the village of Karbala in Iraq. And so those who are linked with Ali, the partisans of Ali, are the Shia, S-H-I-A, and referred as Shiites, S-H-I-I-T-S. And they are the ones, therefore, that really believe that they should have carried the caliphate clear on through, and that others had usurped the position. Anyway, the point is that mourning houses, that is M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, and religious training centers are named after Hussein because of his tremendous courage and his valor in fighting. And they mourn over these sad happenings to their cause. They're the ones who celebrate the 10 days of Ashura, and perhaps you have seen some of these celebrations on the TV as the time rolls around for it. We have Happy Easter and Happy Christmas and the like of this. Their greatest celebration is one of the most sad there is. And so, as you know, little kiddies, only 3-4 years old, and men have their heads stroked with razors until they're bleeding, or their backs stroked with razors until they're bleeding, and then they will take whips and flog themselves as they march. And you see a river of people flowing past. This is all done, of course, after a reenactment in public theater of the death of Hussein. And these people get themselves into a tremendous frenzy as they endeavor to emulate their leader. And as they endeavor to get inside the feeling of compassion and the feeling of devotion and the desire to fight for the truth. And so they're remarkable, and from the standpoint of saying that they are ready and willing to sacrifice themselves for the advancement of their cause. And they rebel against any form of domination and any form of imperialism. And they say, Hussein became the super martyr, and they are endeavoring to get themselves into the same mood of devotion. And so consequently, this provides a tremendous reservoir of people who are ready to spend and be spent for their cause. Furthermore, another factor comes in. You remember we had four bases for the establishment of religious law under the Sunni Islam. However, Shia Islam believes that from the time of Ali and every single caliph leader, they had 12 in the long run, rival caliphs, every single outstanding spiritual leader called an Imam Mahdi is a specially guided, specially illuminated instructor from God Almighty for their band, the Shiites. And so they don't just merely look backward to the traditions or to the Quran to get what they consider their ethical direction for living day by day. They look to the current spiritual leader. And that's how come Ayatollah Khomeini has such tremendous power over the Shiites of Iran. And so we get on into this revolution in Iran because the Shiites are in back of it. Iran, formerly named Persia, was the first nation to accept the Shia faith as a state religion way back yonder in 1502 AD. Though a somewhat secular government served the nation under the Shah Reza Pahlavi, you know that the Shiites hated him. They considered him a tyrant. And in fact, he did have a secret service that was tremendously effective. It is reckoned that 50,000 Iranians lost their lives under the rule of the Shah Pahlavi in his reign alone. And this is one of the reasons why you have the counteraction on the part of the Shiites, and particularly Ayatollah Khomeini, in retaliation. The Shiites also resented the westernization that came in with the Shahs endeavoring to modernize Persia, or Iran as we know it. They resented this because it brought in ever so many things that Islam was not ready to entertain. For instance, the introduction of the unveiling of the women and the introduction of movies from the West, particularly uncensored movies were coming in. The introduction of bars and brothels and the like of this was absolutely against Muslim behavior, and consequently they calculated that this modernization that was coming in from the West was destroying their youth, destroying their families. Youth were rebellious. The adults, the seniors, had no more power over them anymore, and they calculated the cultural price was too high to pay for that type of thing. And so they went on a rampage all of 1978 and all of 1979 in these public demonstrations, and you know the story. The Shah had to abdicate his throne, and he had to leave, and he finally found shelter under the arms of Sadat in Egypt. Then, of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini came back in from exile in Paris, and he came in as the leader and the voice of the Shiite faith. And consequently, the revolution in Iran came off with tremendous enthusiasm because they had overpowered what they calculated was the Shah and the Western culture and USA, which had tacitly supported the Shah all the way through. And so others stood by and watched to see how well Ayatollah Khomeini and his regime could carry the affairs of state. And they did it, actually, for the first 2 years. They put down armed rebellion within the nation. They managed to keep the currency running and money in the till for the government, and they also retained control of state affairs. And so other nations that had big question marks in their mind as to whether this revolution was going to be worth anything and have any staying power began to sink. And so Ayatollah Khomeini sent invitations to more than 24 Islamic and Middle East nations, inviting 380 men of revolutionary position or of religious position into a seminar in Tehran. And the topic that they were to study was what it means to the ideal Islamic state. What is the ideal Islamic state? People didn't really pay much attention to this seminar. I mean, it was rather quietly engineered and quietly convened, and the convocation went through. In all of the rhetoric, after you got through, in all of the rhetoric, though, the bottom line was that they were absolutely against the West, and they had to reestablish Islam, and Islam had to spread worldwide. In fact, one of those who participated in that seminar later summarized it as this. First, number one, that religion should not be separated from politics. Secondly, the only way to achieve true independence was to return to Islamic roots. Third, there shall be no reliance on superpowers or any outsiders. In fact, the whole area should be cleared of outsiders. And fourthly, the Shia should take a much more active part in getting rid of the foreign powers. And so this seminar, rather unnoticed by the world, became a tremendous turning point in the thinking of the Islamic world. Locally, right there in Iran itself, they cracked down on the communists, the Tudeh party, just as well as against the All-American Satan. And when the 4th anniversary of the independence of their nation came round, which was, by the way, just a month after the conclusion of this convocation, the seminar, they were spitting and tramping on the hammer and the sickle just as angrily as they were on the stars and stripes. So they wanted to clear the nation of any outside ideologies. And then 2 years after this, however, all of these ayatollahs and sheiks and mullahs who had been at this tremendous convocation of 380 from 24 countries hadn't been able to fire up the nations to which they had gone back. And so it seemed like the revolution really wasn't picking up any momentum on its own steam whatsoever. And so they Ayatollah and his radical mullahs began to set the pace for things right there in Iran. Things took a turn to be much more drastic. They persuaded, quoting from the Quran, such sentences as these to the young kiddies, to the children, quote, "Wars come to provide martyrs, and that God may prove those who truly believe in him." The second quotation. Paradise is only to be obtained when God knows those who are really ready to strive and to endure. End quotation. And further, it was taught them that these young fellows that were volunteering for active service in the army, especially in fighting the war against Iraq, would be soldiers of God, martyrs that gained heaven immediately. And so they rallied hundreds and thousands that were voluntarily ready and willing to go to do this. And they put white headbands on these little chaps, from 16 to 18, 20 years old, well, even down to 13 to 14, and sent them out over the Iraqi live minefields to be blown up in order to clear the mines so that Iran's troops then could make the grand assault. And thousands of them died as they had believed they were going on the way to heaven in the cause of God. Then, about this time, the Honorable Khomeini took upon himself another title. He gave it to himself, called the Guardian of Religious Lawmaking. Now remember, the Shiites had this provision. There is no more authoritative title for any Shiite leader on earth. Since Iran is the only major Shia-dominated power in the world, and the Ayatollah is the supreme spiritual leader of the Shia faith, he guides not only the religious affairs within his own nation, but also the affairs of many, because there are millions of Shiites in other countries. Take, for instance, as an example, Turkey. Out of the 45 million inhabitants of Turkey, 1/5 of them are Shiites. So the say-so of the Ayatollah way up yonder in Quran affects what happens many a time in Turkey, just because of his religious authority. Well, I must pass. I would like to tell you about what I've written up concerning Egypt. But I just pass that over because our time is passing so fast. Let me just deal a wee bit about Lebanon's aggressive pace. 15 years ago, an uneasy truce held the Maronite Christians and the Sunni Muslims together in the ruling powers of Lebanon. Now, it was a rather unusual thing. It was divided almost 50-50. The population was almost 50-50 Christian as versus Muslim. And yet the state constitution went on to the provisions that really the key office holders, those who were in key positions, were Christians. And that galled the Shiites, especially those who were down in the south, because although they outnumbered the Sunni Muslims, they didn't have a voice in government. Only the Shiites, the Sunni Muslims, had the voice in government, and the poor Shiites were left down yonder as poor peasant farmers and shepherds on the southern hills of southern Lebanon. And it so happened that the Palestinians that were kicked out of the West Bank and went on into Jordan and were kicked out of Jordan by King Hussein, fled on into the southern hills of Lebanon. And they soon forgot the fact that they were guests in a foreign country. And they began to set up roadblocks. They began to charge fines or taxes or fees, whatever you want to call, for people to travel in their own country. And furthermore, they heaped many other indignities on them. If they wanted a block of land, they would kick the owner right off and take it by sheer military power. And of course, they wore out their welcome fast, you can imagine. And as a result, these people were really, really oppressed. Furthermore, Israel was coming over with airplanes time and again, and their bombs were falling not only on the PLO, they were falling as well on the poor Shiites, the native people. And so the Shiites resented these PLO personnel. And then when Israel came charging in 1982, they were actually welcomed by the Shiites in southern Lebanon as liberators, kicking these Palestinians out of the country. And they were thrilled to death when they bottled them up in Beirut. And the longer they stayed in Beirut, the longer they were bombarded and ruined that poor city, at least sections of that wonderful city. And finally, of course, they had to give up. And so 14,000 PLO people did flee by more or less controlled export to other Arab nations. And then Israel got into a jam. Because if they stayed, they would earn the resentment of not only the Shiites, who took the Israelites more or less as a second army of occupation, just as bad as the PLO. They would also incur the wrath of the Sunni Muslims as well. And yet, on the other hand, if Israel went away and withdrew, the PLO would come right back in, and their whole invasion tactic would have been in vain. So they elected to stay, hoping that they could hold on until a stable government was formed. Well, sad to say, that didn't develop. And as a result, they stayed on until they wore themselves out. And the cost was too high. So they staged a phased withdrawal. And so here was, for the first time, the strongest military power in the Middle East foiled. And they had to withdraw. How come? Because a handful of Shiites, these poor farmers and shepherds in the south, calculated that they were ready to spend and be spent even unto death to get rid of them. And it worked. And so they became the Amal group that I have referred to. But the Amal group was far too tame for the Hezbollah group. The Hezbollah calculated that the Amal group were all too tame, even though they had taken southern Beirut and had already driven the Christians out of West Beirut into East Beirut. Nonetheless, the Hezbollah said they weren't devoted enough and they weren't radical enough, they weren't militant enough, and so they started Hezbollah, the party of God. And consequently, they're the ones who calculate that murder, hijacking, kidnappings, holding of hostages, or anything else is within the law because they are fighting against the great Satan America, and particularly Israel. Israel is the closest of their hated nations, and they calculate that they should go down there and overpower that nation and turn it into an Islamic state. Jerusalem should come back under the control of Muslims, and furthermore, all of the occupied lands that are now occupied by the Israelis after the Six-Day War and so forth, that should be returned to the Muslims and the Palestinians and so forth. And they mean it. I mean, this hijacking I heard on the news yesterday, that the same personnel that handled that big hijacking of the TWA flight are the very same Muslim fellows that are handling this hijacking. It's the Hezbollah group that are so radical, and there's no more dangerous group in all of the Middle East than the Hezbollah party. I was wanting to give you a quotation from Sheikh Fadullah, who is the one that Friday after Friday after Friday preaches this militant brand and tells them what to do, but I must pass that over. Anyway, finally, when America, unfortunately, used the battleship New Jersey and fired rounds of ammunition from the Mediterranean right into Beirut and into Lebanon, although America was supposed to have been among the peacekeeping force, they lost their neutrality. And Lebanon realized it. And Americans became hated because of this. And as a consequence, the Shiites set to do something about it. And so they established this young chap that would drive a truck that was loaded with TNT. And it went right into the tremendous U.S. barracks, the U.S. forces, killing all of those Marines, more than 240 that I have referred to. And Fadullah, the sheikh that is exhorting these people, in endeavoring to make an explanation, said, you know, we only resort to tactics such as this, terrorism such as this, just like a doctor. When he does everything he can possibly do without surgery, but has to do surgery, then he performs surgery. And so this was his explanation and justification, presumably. I must bypass Libya's role. I wish I could have told you more about that. But let's consider Islam's recent growth. May I just say, though, about Egypt and Libya. What has happened with the Shiite Muslims and their tremendous zeal and their unending supply of martyrs has fired the Sunni Muslims into what is called jihad, special exertion, which really goes all the way to holy war. And so Egypt is still treading the knife edge, trying to keep a balance. You remember that in January of last year, 30 people were apprehended for trying to overthrow Mubarak's government. And just in May of last year, one of his ministers, there was an attempt on the life of one of his ministers, and that fellow is to be tried and judged as well. And so the Sunni Muslims are also encouraged and fired by the Shiite Muslims, particularly out of Iran and Lebanon, as setting the pace. May I just point out, however, that there are colonial powers. When the colonial powers withdrew, those nations that were under colonial power, and did you know that France and Britain and Belgium and England controlled 90% of Muslim lands during the colonial period? And so then when they withdrew their colonial power, those who were, particularly in the majority in countries that were predominantly Muslim, rose to power and seized power and felt that the tide had turned on their behalf. I wish I could tell you the growth of the Arab League and the Islamic Congress and the Islamic Council of Europe and conferences in Lahore and London and the like of that. But anyway, what they are endeavoring to do is come to a consensus. Now they realize they can never establish a unified world caliphate. So they're endeavoring to come together in a unity behind the Sharia, the laws of Islam. And that's what they are planning to do. My time is up, and I did want to show you a wee bit concerning what is happening in Sierra Leone. Islam came to the west coast of Africa very gently. Traders brought it in, really. They would come in and they were Muslim traders, and they would hold their devotions 5 times a day, or at least morning and night. Pretty soon they would try to establish a little mosque in the center of town, and pretty soon others began to pray. Now they were praying in Arabic, the ritual prayer, which I'll tell you about tomorrow night, but the people calculated, it's true. I mean, God must have created the world. We should be worshiping one God. And then furthermore, these Muslims are tremendously adept at adapting Islam to those who are converted out of animistic cultures. I wish I could get into a description of that. But for instance, where they used to have sorcerers that would divine as to what was wrong, they would do the same thing from the Muslim standpoint. Where they would want sorcerers to predict what would be coming in the tomorrows, Muslim priests did the same thing. And where they wanted fetishes and amulets and bracelets and phylacteries made out of the Quran as a substitute for the old fetishes and charms that they had when they got them from the sorcerer, they would produce these. And so they had something visible and tangible, supposedly linked from Allah's divine word, to trust Him. Probably they had placebo effect. But anyway, they went along with it. And so consequently, they have been tremendously effective from the standpoint of accommodating those who are converted from the animistic background into the Muslim faith. We must cut things short. I have so much more to tell you about the challenge of Islam, especially from a theological point of view, but I must wave it away. Shall we have the lights up, please? And we'll have a few pictures from Sierra Leone. Way up north from Freetown, Sierra Leone, is a place called Bafodia. Perhaps some of you have read of Reverend George Huff opening up that station. In Bafodia, there is a little mosque showing the fact that there are Muslims there as well. And this gentleman and his family, in fact he has 2 wives and other kiddies, is the imam of the mosque. and they are endeavoring to carry on for the advancement of the cause of Islam way up yonder in the northern part of Sierra Leone among the Wara Limba people. Thank the Lord, the chief of the area, who, by the way, is the oldest living chief in all of Sierra Leone, he is a Christian. And we praise the Lord for the tremendous results of the missionary work up yonder, especially within the last 2 to 3 years. They have reckoned that there are 3,000 new converts in the Bafodia Kamuke region. 4 new pastors are moving into this area to establish new churches in this very conference year. This is a friend of mine, Al-Haji Sisi. The fact that he has this headgear on reveals the fact that he has been all the way to Mecca, and he comes back as a bearer of the name Al-Haji, one who has completed the Hajj. And this is, of course, one of the 5 main pillars of Islam, one of the 5 main obligatory duties of a Muslim, which hopefully, when accomplished, will get him on through to paradise. I ask him to kindly pose these pictures. Portions of the Quran, you know, the Quran is supposed to be the kalam, the voice of God, the speech of God itself. And so consequently, it is written out on little tablets like this. Notice how indigenous they are. They make their ink out of soot. They use a pen made out of elephant grass, and they write on a wooden slate. And nonetheless, this then becomes what is used for the little students to memorize in Arabic with no interpretation whatsoever to Limba, Timni, Loko, or whatever language. They memorize passage after passage from these wooden slates. But also, this is anything that comes in touch with Allah's word is supposed to have magical, supernatural power. And consequently, ink is often washed off of slates like this and put into bottles, and this holy water is used as a lotion. Are you going on a trip today? Are you going to seal a business deal today? If you want protection from the evil spirits that would not delude you or foil the bargain, then you better have the protection of Allah's word. And particularly the last 2 surahs, chapters of the Quran, are particularly potent, presumably, against evil spirits. And so these then are written up by day, and then in the afternoons, many times, the little kiddies will memorize these hour after hour for 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes they will push it off until night. The kiddies have gone out in the bush, got bundles of sticks and twigs and the like of this to have a fire. They sit around the fire for about an hour and a half, memorizing to the top of their voices portions of the Quran. Many times, portions of the Quran are copied onto paper, rolled up, and put into amulets such as these. They are charms that presumably ward off the effects of evil spirits. This fellow, as you can see, has come for surgery at our medical hospital at Kamakui. And so you have not only phylacteries made out of portions of the Quran, you have as well bottles of holy water made from portions of the Quran. And as I've said, they are tremendously adept at appealing to those who are recently won from Islam to be worshiping the one true God, but on the other hand, depending on these things, which are mere substitutes for their old charms. The man who built this mosque is Al-Haji Wuro, and while he was at Mecca, he pledged to God that by his grace, if he ever got back, he and his brother would build this mosque. And he testified to me as I was standing by here, this minaret wasn't quite completed. We were standing in the shade of this minaret about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he told me that, I know Allah was with me right from the beginning, because from the time I laid the foundation to this house of God, I have never lacked anything. God has always supplied everything I need for the construction of this mosque. But you know what he also said? Over yonder is Robing, and that's only 2 miles away. They're Christians. Now, I know the people that come to my mosque only come to please me. They really don't come to worship God. But those Christians, they're sincere. When they say yes, they mean yes. When they say no, they mean no. And the man who was the head of the Islam Africa training Christians to work with Muslims, he heard this conversation and he told me later, I have never, ever heard a Muslim al-Haji downgrade his religion and upgrade Christianity. And we just praise the Lord for that tremendous testimony. And so, especially on Friday, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the faithful come in to pray. Of course, as it was in the days of Moses, they leave their shoes off with the view of believing that they are on holy ground, and they move on in. Women are not allowed in the mosque proper. They have to sit on the outside or even in the yard. But the men and the children can go in. They will hear a sermon and then have the ritual prayers. And it's quite a series. It's a performance. It's actually elevating merit into the eyes of God as they do this. And so this is so true of Muslims, and they are reaching hundreds and thousands, even of little kiddies that will be coming up through the ranks of Islam as well. We shall see in a moment that even the mothers are now being much more involved. The Ahmadiyya movement is a recent rationalistic movement of a branch of Islam that sprung up in India. Now, some Muslims call them heretics and won't have any fellowship with them whatsoever. But these people are the most antichrist and the most radical and the most up-to-date. They provide hospitals, they provide clinics, they provide secondary schools, and here is one of their new secondary schools. So they too are endeavoring to reach the youth. The girls fully as much as the boys. And so there's a tremendous challenge for the youth in Sierra Leone, and we thank the Lord for the fact that we have the splendid school system that we do. Notice this is in Freetown, and we already have 2 mosques, hardly a stone's throw away from each other, and they are quite strong in Freetown, the capital city of the nation. They received their independence in April 1961, and I happened to be there 20 years later when they had their parade of celebration. And what really shocked me was this. I snapped these pictures. Those white are Muslim women who have gone all the way to Mecca, some of them on to Medina, completed the pilgrimage, and come back. And it is shocking. Now, when you have father and mother affording the pilgrimage, the money is coming from somewhere else. They just don't have that much money. And this is exactly what's happening. Nations like Saudi Arabia, for instance, with $66 billion a year as their national government, gross national product, devote 7% of the GNP to helping smaller nations, especially those favorable to Islam, to carry out the pilgrimages and build secondary schools and the like of this. And so Islam is on the march. Not only here in USA, which I didn't even get to touch on, not only in England, where they have lost, by the way, 650 churches in the last 20 years, but gained 300 mosques in England, the land of John Wesley. The tide's rolling in. We've got to be on the job. And so I hope that, although this is rather a negative presentation, I do hope that in the tomorrows you will see the more positive side in reaching Muslims and the power of the Word and the power of the Spirit to bring even Muslims to a knowledge of the Christ. Thank you for your good attention. Amen.
We're grateful to Dr. Birch for this presentation. You've caught just a little bit of his vision and his burden tonight. We invite you to come again tomorrow, BWC campus at 7 o'clock, and also Friday evening at 7 and Saturday morning for the complete series, if you can. I'm sure that some of you will want to do that.